The five-part dress. In many ways, the name explains the construction itself. The garment is traditionally made from 5 separate fabric panels. The first panel forms the left sleeve. The second panel forms the left side of the garment body, including both the front and back portions. The third panel forms the right side of the body, again including both the front and back sections. The fourth panel forms the right sleeve, and the fifth panel is the smaller inner front panel. Patterns and detailed sewing resources for five-part dress are surprisingly difficult to find online. So this project became part historical recreation and part personal experiment. The version I'm making today is inspired by garments associated with 18th century Vietnam, particularly after the clothing reforms connected to Lord Nguyen Phuc Coat in 1744. What fascinates me most is that this garment still survives in modern Vietnamese culture. It isn't simply a museum object. People still wear five-part dress today for traditional events, weddings, cultural festivals, and ceremonies. There's something beautiful about a historical garment that never entirely disappeared. For this first attempt, I decided to work in cotton rather than silk, partly because silk is expensive, and partly because I wanted permission to make mistakes. This version is almost like a prototype, a way to understand the structure before eventually making a finer version in silk later on. Since I couldn't find a commercial sewing pattern, I drafted everything myself according to my own measurements, which is both exciting and mildly terrifying. There is a very specific kind of confidence required to cut directly into fabric, while only mostly sure you understand what you're doing. One thing I love about historical garments is how geometric many of them are. First, I'll use colored thread to temporarily secure the seams and check whether the fit of the garment suits the body before permanently sewing everything together. Because I drafted this pattern myself, a large portion of this process involved staring at reference images, measuring myself repeatedly, which honestly may be the most historically accurate part of the experience. For this project, I wanted to sew the garment entirely by hand. Not because it is the fastest option, it absolutely is not, but because hand sewing changes your relationship with a garment. You become aware of every seam, every layer, every slight inconsistency. The hand sewing process follows a fairly specific order. First, I sew the center back seam, joining the 2 back panels together into one complete back piece. In some places, I was also able to use the selvage edge of the fabric itself, which meant those edges didn't need additional finishing at all. Historical sewing often feels less like following instructions, and more like quietly solving problems one seam at a time. Second, I attach the 2 sleeves to the body of the garment and then finish the raw edges of those sleeve seams by hand. Third, I sew the long seam running underneath the arm, essentially completing the sleeve tube itself, and then continue sewing the underarm area and one side seam of the garment. Most of the construction here is done with running stitch and back stitch. Running stitch is quick and flexible, while back stitch creates a much stronger seam. And because I'm not using a serger, I needed other ways to finish the raw edges. So many of the seams are enclosed by folding the raw edges inward and stitching them down by hand. It takes longer, but the inside becomes beautifully clean. After that, I also finished the raw edges of all of those seams. Fourth, I sew the hems of both sleeves. Fifth, I finished the edges of the small front panel, the front flap where the buttons will eventually be attached. And then sew that panel onto the main body of the garment. Sixth, I attach the collar to the body. Normally, the collar would be sewn separately first and then attached to the garment afterward as a finished piece. But here, I decided to try a small experiment. Instead of constructing the collar first, I attached the two collar pieces directly onto the garment before sewing them together into the final collar shape. And now I understand exactly why people do not usually do it this way. It is extremely difficult. Very difficult to keep the collar symmetrical, balanced, and smooth. So, not recommended. I will crochet the buttons. There are many ways to make fabric buttons for the 5-part dress, but since I already have yarn and a crochet hook on hand, I'm going to crochet the buttons with yarn. Seventh, I finish the edges along the hem of the garment. And finally, I sew on all of the buttons. Then I check the entire garment for any remaining unfinished edges and hand finish those as well to fully complete and after many hours of sewing. The 5-part dress is finally finished. There are certainly things I would improve next time. I already have a growing list. But I think that's part of learning historical dressmaking. The first garment teaches you how to make the second one better. And eventually, I would love to revisit this project in silk, perhaps with even more historically accurate materials and techniques. But for now, I'm simply happy that this exists. A garment sewn slowly, by hand, connected to a history that still feels alive. Thank you so much for spending this time sewing with me. I'd love to know if you've ever encountered Vietnamese historical dress before, or if this is your first introduction to 5-part dress. And if you enjoy historical sewing, textile history, and handmade garments, I hope you'll stay for future projects. Until next time.